And today we are going to have a very exciting, very stimulating conversation between the author of the book, What is World Literature? And the author of the book, What is a World? And Professor Pheng Cheah, professor of University of California at Berkeley, is one of the most outstanding theorists in literary studies in nationalism, transnationalism, and globalization, and so on. And in response to his book, Professor David Damrosch, who is a very well-known specialist of world literary studies, and his book, What is World Literature, has been translated into Japanese as 世界文学とは何か. Maybe some of you have the copy of the translation. And he, in response to Professor Pheng Cheah's book, Professor David Damrosch will have a conversation with him before you. So it's one of the most exciting highlights of the whole event already at the outset of our 1 month marathon event.
So thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Numano and also Vice President Haneda. At the end of my remarks, I'll actually say something that relates to what he said about the idea of the world and the globe, but alas, he's left the room. It's a great pleasure. First of all, I'd like to thank David for inviting me to be in discussion with him. I want to say that it's a great pleasure for me because the title of my book very clearly alludes to David's book, What is World Literature? I've learned a great deal from David's book, which if it hasn't inaugurated a new field in literary studies, has certainly reinvigorated it and given it a new life. I can say that I would not have written my book if I had not read his. And the question that I wanted to ask in my book is really prolegomeno to the question of David's book, namely, when we speak of world literature, but also of related fields like world history, world cinema, world religion, world art, and world music, what exactly do we mean by the term world? And as I said to David in email when he very graciously invited me to be in conversation with him, my interest in worldliness is a long-standing one. That predates my interest in world literature, because unlike almost everyone else who has written on world literature recently, I don't teach in a literature department, I teach in a rhetoric department. My interest in worldliness comes from an older interest in cosmopolitanism, about which I have written a fair bit. Because my PhD is in literary criticism, people in literary studies kept asking me about the relation between cosmopolitanism and world literature. And initially I wasn't interested in the topic because my work in cosmopolitanism actually grows out of questions that seemed to me at that point more germane to moral and political philosophy, the narrative social sciences, and even public international law. But I couldn't very well tell people I wasn't interested, so I hemmed and hawed. And finally, I decided to write this book, partly in response to the writing on world literature in the late 1990s and the early 2000s that sought to link it to global dynamics and take it beyond the musty and dusty idea of the great books that constitute the literary heritage of humanity. And of course, you know these works, beginning with Franco Moretti's essays in the New Left Review, Pascal Casanova's book, The World Republic of Letters, which appeared in French when I was a graduate student, and that my teacher, Benedict Anderson, was very excited about, and of course, David's book. What struck me about these new theories of world literature is that its key defining term was underspecified and unexamined, not rigorously defined. They defined world literature as something that was opposed to national literature and linked it in a certain way to globalization. So it seemed to me that it was primarily, the term world, a descriptive term, where the world was taken to be the same as a globe. So what I felt they had in mind was global literature, literature that circulated globally. But global literature is not a highbrow phrase. So world literature, with its nod to the lineage of Goethe's normative project of Weltliteratur, was used instead. But then I thought a little bit about this, and in a kind of mea culpa moment, also realized that if one looks at the literature on cosmopolitanism, including my own work, although there is a more elaborate understanding of the concept of world compared to world literature, and the world is seen as a normative term that signifies some kind of project with an ideal horizon, at some point the discourse about cosmopolitanism became dogmatic because it took something for granted, namely the equation of world with human intersubjective intercourse. Because if the world is constituted through circulation, and this is the meaning of the world that comes from David's book, for example, then what puts things into circulation are human subjects. And here the reference points are classical Greek philosophy, French Enlightenment thought, Kant, and Marx. Now, if you leave out for the moment the complexity of the Greek term kosmos, which is not the same as the Latin term mundus, and focus largely on the modern idea of world, then world is universal human intercourse, whether you think about it as literary intercourse or as the material intercourse of commerce. And in the latter sense, Marx said world history and world literature only come about once there is a world market. But then why should one take this for granted, that the world is constituted by human intercourse? So my interest in worldliness was not in the first instance an ethico-political interest. It was also not related to post-coloniality. Worldliness is, for me, to use an unfashionable word, an ontological issue. What account of world literature would a fuller ontological account of the world lead to? Now, recent theories of world literature see the world as constituted through circulation, circulatory movement. So the world is here primarily a spatial category. It's an object of the greatest possible spatial extension that serves as a container for all objects and subjects. What is worldly about literature is its locomotion in Mercatorian space, according to the mathematical coordinates of Euclidean geometry. Accordingly, world literature is the exchange or circulation of an object, literature, or a sum of objects, between subjects, its movement across the flat spatial distance in time, conceived spatially. Now, in its conventional definition, as the expansion of our circle of belonging, from the family to the village to the nation and then to the world, cosmopolitanism involves an outward movement that breaches and transcends spatial territorial borders. Worldly intercourse transcends the boundaries of the territorial state and the imagined community of the nation. It follows from this that world literature's cosmopolitanism consists of the impact of such spatial movements on the production, reception, and interpretation of literary texts. Literature's worldliness, then, refers to the global scale of the production, circulation, consumption, and evaluation of literature, understood in analogy with the reach of a global market. Now, this is the point of view that I tried to put forward in the book, that there are two shortcomings to this spatial understanding of worldliness. First of all, it seemed to me that the world is originally a temporal category from which its normative dimension derives. The mundane, or the worldly, refers to the temporal condition of finite existence, as opposed to the infinity of the divine. The normative vocation of worldly humanity is to transcend finite particularity. And this transcendence is at the essence of Goethe's spiritualist project of Weltliteratur, which aims to bring out universal humanity through its particular literary expressions. In the hands of someone like Erich Auerbach, world literature was necessarily connected to a teleology of world history that Professor Haneda spoke about earlier. In contrast, the recent equation of worldliness with the global circulation of literary works, it seemed to me, disregarded the temporal dimension of the world and flattened out its horizontal character. Consequently, in recent accounts of world literature, only a minimal normativity remains, the overcoming of national territorial borders. And indeed, if you look at the phenomenological understanding of worldliness, the spatialization of the world as epitomized by globalization is even a process of unworlding, Entweltlichung. It destroys the worldliness of the world by reducing it to a globe. Now, second, understanding world literature in terms of global circulation implies that literary processes reflect global processes. In the case of someone like Casanova or Moretti, this means that literature has at best a very weak causal or formative power in relation to the world. And this echoes Marx's characterization of spiritual formations as a superstructure to a second degree, the superstructure of the legal and political superstructure of the bourgeois state. Accordingly, the world-making power that normative theories attribute to world literature as a means for actualizing humanity and humanizing the existing world becomes lost. In contrast, what I argued is that if you view the world as a temporal category instead of a spatial object, that is to say, not as an object but as a process of worlding, then literature can be said to have a fundamental connection with worldliness. For example, philosophers from the phenomenological tradition, and the people I looked at in my book were Heidegger, Hannah Arendt, and Jacques Derrida, they gave to literature a privileged role in their accounts of the world. For Heidegger, poetry disclosed the worlding of the world. For Hannah Arendt, drama is the best example of the creation of the world as a subjective in-between of words and deeds, speaking and action. And for Derrida, narrative is tied to the opening of the world by the gift of time. In other words, literature does not merely map the spatialized world and give it value and meaning. Rather, the formal structures of literature enact the opening of a world by the giving and coming of time. And this is, for me, an antidote to the relegation of literature to a shadowy infrastructure. And we may therefore speak of the world as having a literary structure, that is to say, something that is more infrastructural, to adopt Marx's language, than the material reality of economic production. Now, if we understand world literature in terms of literature's connection to worlding and the coming of time, this, it seems to me, points to imminent resources for resisting capitalist globalization. Capitalist accumulation needs and takes time. Capital is augmented by rational technologies and calculations that appropriate and manage time for the maximal extraction of surplus value. But capital does not want to destroy time because it grows by appropriating time. Indeed, even if it wanted to, capital can neither give itself time nor destroy it. And this means that an irreducible principle of real messianic hope is always structural to capitalist globalization, because the persistence of time, that time persists, is infrastructural to capital and it cannot be destroyed. And as an enactment of the opening of worlds by the coming of time, world literature, in my understanding of the term, points to something that will always exceed and disrupt capital. And what I therefore tried to propose was a normative account of world literature, that is, one that does not merely analyze how literary works circulate around the world or are produced with a global market in mind, but that seeks to understand the normative force that literature can exert in the world, the ethico-political horizon it opens up for the existing world. In other words, a given work of world literature can be an active power in the making of worlds. It is the site where different processes of worlding are played out in a historically specific field of forces, and an agent that participates and intervenes in these processes. And now I move on and talk a little bit about post-colonial literature. Post-colonial literature is, for me, an exemplary case of world literature in this robust normative sense, because post-colonial literature is concerned with the opening of worlds, and it seeks to participate in worlding processes. I think it's important to remember here that the cartographical view of the world is directly related to the history of European imperialism and its management of time according to the grid of Greenwich Mean Time. So this is an image that William Kentridge sent me that illustrates what I mean from his installation, The Refusal of Time. He talks about how, in fact, if you think about the cartography of the world, in terms of longitudes and latitudes and centered on Greenwich Mean Time, centered in Greenwich, that this is a way of kind of straitjacketing these kinds of subjects. The cartographical processes that created the modern world system eradicated other cultures, their ways of life and temporalities by their incorporation into the modern world system, especially with temporalities where the relation of humankind to non-human beings is not one of instrumental control and domination. And these technologies continue in a more intense fashion in capitalist globalization. The unworlding they bring about include colonial dispossession, chattel slavery, various forms of capitalist exploitation, and environmental degradation. Decolonization is precisely a project of reworlding so that new subjects can emerge in the existing world, transforming it through this emergence. And these are two stills from the Refusal of Time by William Kentridge, where he talks about how, in fact, you can understand decolonization and these anti-colonial revolts as exploding the kinds of maps that are sketched out by colonial cartography. And this involves the initiation of new or alternative temporalities. As part of their ethico-political vocation, the post-colonial novels that I study as world literature provide cognitive mappings of the position of post-colonial societies in the grid of temporal management. For example, the temporal regimes of sugar capital, international tourist flows of tourist money, humanitarian aid, wildlife preservation funding, and funding for economic development. For example, the Jamaica of Michelle Cliff's Claire Savage novels, the India of Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, the Somalia of Nuruddin Farah's Gifts, and the Philippines of Ninochka Rosker's State of War, and Timothy Moe's Hello, Hello. They craft new stories of world belonging for peoples in the post-colonial South by drawing on other temporalities that have persisted from pre-colonial non-European traditions and foreground the tensions with global capitalist regimes of temporal governance and point to the opening of worlds. Now, just as a final remark before I look forward to David's response, a caveat. The modern ontological concept of world that I reconstruct in the book has a specific filiation to Abrahamic religious traditions, especially to Christianity. Despite his attempt to break with the Greek and Christian concepts of cosmos and world, Heidegger's phenomenological account of the world as worlding ends up affirming a Eurocentric metaphysics of presence because he privileges Greek and German as the only languages capable of expressing being. Ideally, what I should have done in the book would have been to situate the modern capitalist world system and contemporary globalization in terms of the complicity between Eurocentrism, colonialism, and modernity, and then attempted to reconceptualize the world and world literature by drawing on non-European cultural and religious traditions. For example, the Chinese concept of Tianxia, all that is under heaven, which is not Shijie, the title, for example, of Jia Zhanghe's film, which has been translated as The World, or the distinctions in Arabic also found in Indonesian and Malay between alam, dunya, and bumi, so that the modern capitalist world system could be ethically transformed for the better in the image of alternative non-Western modernities and the rhythm of different cultural temporalities. But in fact, there should be as many world concepts and therefore many ideas about world literature as there are languages and cultures, and this would be the only way to reground world literature. Unfortunately, one person can only do so much, and this, I think, has to be collaborative work among scholars of Europe, East Asia, the Arab world, Africa, and so on. So I very much hope that this, obviously you have to have some kind of institutional support and basis for this kind of thing, that this kind of comparative work can actually begin between these different ideas of world, and whether it will lead us to a fuller account of world literature. So thank you, and I look forward to David's response.
So I do want to commend very strongly Pheng Cheah's book to your attention. Also, his previous book, The Spectral Nationality, which I think coincidentally is 2003, the same year as my What is World Literature
Yes.
book, Very interesting. I'll have occasion perhaps to mention that a bit. And I really wanted to think about a couple of general questions and of the relation of post-colonial and world literature studies. And with Pheng Cheah's book seemed to me to have some commonalities with a couple of other recent books. Emily Apter's Against World Literature from 2013, and the new book called Confined and Uneven Development Towards a New Theory of World Literature by the Warwick Collective, or REC, 2015, just a year before Pheng's book. And there seem to be questions for you, Pheng. Really, and I'll give some illustration, sort of four dichotomies, it seems to me, in these three books generally are a little starkly posed or not fully worked through. One is that between temporality versus history, particularly literary history. One is space versus time, and this question of the cartographic, whether it's too straightforward to say, oh, there's one kind of, the physical cartography is just descriptive, whereas the temporal remapping is really changing the world in a different way. One is world versus nation, whereas you pose the world literature assumes no borders, or the withering away of nations I don't think has happened. And there's a question of how far world literary studies can and has already perhaps started to take account of that. And finally, on the political level, revolution versus reform, or you could say radicalism versus liberalism, or progressivism. I think the progressive is a term that gets adopted by either branch. So I wanted to think about this. And temporality versus history, one of the things that really struck me, having read these three books relatively recently together, is that also Emily Apter's book talks about the need to rethink cartographies of time. Periodicity, she talks about the Eurochronology has to be given up, so she's already broaching some of these issues. But in her book, as in these other two books, virtually every example is 20th century. And as important as it is to rethink modernism, it's only the tip of the iceberg of periodization, and indeed the, to some degree, least problematic period compared to a term like medieval or classical or ancient, which don't line up nearly as well worldwide as they do. And indeed, many of the examples in these books, most of them are from the last 50 years or so of literary production, which is the most recent 2% in the history of literacy to date. In the United States, it was the Occupy Wall Street movement on behalf of the 98%. I think we need to occupy comparative literature on behalf of the 98% of history of literature, which is increasingly occluded. And what I want to ask you, Pheng, about this is, and I think your last comments very much already begin to answer my question, but what is the trade-off in the very strong concentration on the present, if you want to look at alternative temporalities, while occluding most of the history of literature? Does that, because, I mean, you say it's exemplary, but then when none of these books goes back before 1900, I wonder, is it necessary to foreshorten the temporal span in order to talk about alternative temporalities, or is there, what's gained and what's the trade-off that you would see with that?
Oh, so do I?
Perhaps you'd like to,
yeah.
I'm very curious as your first thought about that.
Okay, so I would say, first of all, that, I mean, the way that world history is being defined, say, for instance, Professor Haneda brought up Hegel. And certainly in Marx, world history is something that is a modern phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that only, for Marx, comes into being with this thing called the world market. And it's from then on that you can look back in history, including the classical past, including ancient history, and say that this is a teleology that leads up to modernity. So it's a history, but it's a history of modernity, so to speak. So you would include all these other works from these different periods, so to speak, as part of world literature. But then world literature is really a formation that is a modern phenomenon. It's the path for modernity, so to speak. So in the, say, the examples, there was a very pragmatic reason. One of the questions that I was just mentioning to David prior to this, because one other comment that people always make about my book is, why is it that unlike David's book that really deals with literature of different, not only different periods, but different languages, that the primary texts I look at, other than the host of German philosophers, the novels themselves are written in English. When my teacher, Benedict Anderson, was alive, he read everything I wrote, and I sent him the manuscript of this book, and that was the first thing he said. Why is it you keep talking about multiple temporalities, but all the texts are written in English? And it's really for pragmatic reason, because I had been giving talks about that were based on the book, and it seemed to me that when I gave the talks, I would never get any questions about the novels. They would ask me about the theories, because they never read the novels before, even though I was writing about well-known writers like Amitav Ghosh and so on. And then I thought, because I had initially planned to write on a couple of Indonesian novels, and I was even thinking of writing about Mo Yan, the Chinese novelist. But then I thought, and in that case, one of the Indonesian novels had not been translated. I thought, if it's unlikely that people have read Amitav Ghosh, it's even more unlikely that they would have read this Indonesian novelist. So for pragmatic reasons, I chose to write on texts that were more or less accessible, but I guess that's also part of the world literature paradigm, that something needs to circulate in order for it to make some kind of impact. Now, so then the other question that arose from me is, obviously, if you look at these novels that I'm writing about, they are written in the present, and they are written about present phenomena, but they do try to resurrect temporalities from the past. So, for instance, in the Amitav Ghosh novel, he talks about these kinds of mythic traditions in both in the Islamic world and also in South Asia. And Nuruddin Farah also draws on these kinds of stories from the African tradition. So they do talk about these other kinds, other places, other periods, and so on. But once again, it's about retrieving literature, orature from the past for the purposes of the present. I guess the question is, if you think about the formation of world literature, and you just ask a very simple question, who is it for, or what is it for? I think it's really for people now to make sense of what the world is, and what world literature as part of to use an old-fashioned term, part of the human heritage is for the present. And so there should be, of course, and that's why the works of classical antiquity, Aristotle, Euripides, so on, would always be included in world literature. But then there's always, I think, a distinction. So for instance, let's say you work on Indian classical literature. If you're writing about Indian classical literature as an area specialist, that would be very different from someone who's writing about Indian classical literature as part of world literature. Because if you're doing it as part of world literature, you're doing it, for me it seems, for people in the present understanding the past. Whereas you can be fully immersed, so to speak, or try to pretend you're fully immersed in the past if you're doing it as part of classics, if you're doing it as part of Indian studies, so to speak. So I think that's the difference.
Yeah, so I would push back on that to some degree, because I think that you suggest accepting a kind of Hegelian teleology to a degree that one doesn't necessarily need to do. And even though any history is to some degree history of the present, taking the past for its own terms and not simply for how it's rewritten in the last 20 or 30 years is somewhat different. One little example, the world's first known patron of literature was King Shulgi of Ur, who reigned in the 21st century BCE. And in one of his poems, he imagines becoming world literature. And this was at a time when no one in the world could write other than in Sumeria and Egypt. He says, "Now I swear by the sun god Utu on this very day, and my younger brothers shall be witness of it, in foreign lands where the sons of Sumer are not known, where people do not have the use of paved roads, for example, Europe, for example, Japan, anywhere else, where they have no access to the written word, that is, anywhere other than Egypt, that I, the firstborn son, am a fashioner of words, a composer of songs, a composer of words. They will recite my songs as heavenly writings, and they will bow down before my words." The first known patron of literature is using literature to help bolster his empire. He's creating a small empire in southern Mesopotamia. We have the Epic of Gilgamesh today because he commissioned songs about Gilgamesh. He's the third king of king of the third dynasty of Ur. Gilgamesh was just up the road in Uruk, and Shulgi bolsters himself by making himself a kind of a cousin of Gilgamesh, and he commissions these poems that then become the epic. So already you have very much things that we're interested in today: the role of writing for empire, the words, the futurity. Here it is, a future-oriented thing. But you'll notice he's not actually interested in capitalism, which doesn't yet exist for some millennia. And so part of my question about this, the emphasis in yours and Emily's and the Rick book, is that it seems as though the only kind of world literature worth discussing will be literature that's critiquing global capitalism, which means a priori it's very recent literature, which may reuse earlier stuff, but it's only in this context. And that the only kind of studies of world literature worth doing are those which critique global capitalism as represented in these critiques. So it seems to be rather dismissive sometimes of other approaches, which perhaps goes to some of this, the cartographies of space are just describing the world, whereas the ones of temporality are changing the world. And I wanted to suggest, I mean, these different versions exist everywhere, and not just the United States. So just as you're saying at the end, we need to see different worlds in different places. Here in Germany, too, recent books in Germany, very, very different. You have the kind of idealistic enlightenment of Dieter Landping. It's a handbook of little essays on world writers, milestones of world literature, from the Enlightenment to the present. And you notice world literature is flying up above the clouds, really transcendent. Then you have, just a couple years later, Siegfried Löffler, who is a television and media personality, the new world literature and their great storytellers, as great books, but the great books now are immigrant novels, and all very, very contemporary, and it's a bookseller on the street in Calcutta rather than up in the Himmel, like that. So these are two kinds of world literature that exist, and I'm going to say both have a role today, and not just the one rather than the other. And in fact, each is imbricated with elements of the other, in fact.
So can we go back? Can you go back to that slide before?
Of Shulgi or of? Yes, I'm going the wrong way.
Forward, not backward.
Voila.
Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is the thing.
Yeah.
When he says my song he says heavenly writings. He doesn't say worldly writings. And the question is, I mean, and of course I have no access to these languages, so I have no idea what cosmologically, so to speak, what heaven means in relation to earth, and whether it really does mean what we currently mean by world. All I'm saying really is world literature depends on a modern definition of the world.
And what I'm saying is that this does mean something different, and we have a broader sense of world temporalities. If you imagine, as the Sumerians did, that kingship comes down from heaven, it's the gift of the gods, the king represents the meeting place between the heavenly and the earthly, and he'll spread around the actual earth. It is the real world that he's envisioning as a result. Just to come back to this question of cartographies, it seems to me, and this goes partly to the issue of the revolution versus reform, or the radical versus the progressive. I think of the kind of redoing cartographies of the surrealists, and here Anna Balakian is an interesting figure to me. It's been working on her a bit. Armenian emigre, who, her family leaves Turkey after the genocide and washes up in the United States. And in college she decides She says, naively and perhaps with the idealism of youth, I thought of comparative literature as an antidote to excessive nationalism, and surrealism was the one literature that was reacting against national divisions and even overcoming the barriers between the arts. I thought innocently that with the perspectives of comparative literature and the dissemination of the principles of surrealism, we could change the world. So she doesn't want to describe the world, she wants to change it. So I bought a ticket and made a small financial investment that shaped the rest of my life, which was going to the second meeting, International Comparative Literature Association. And one of the kind of things she's interested in, I pick up this great map from Delia Ungarano's book, From Prayers to Tlön, Surrealism as World Literature, and thinking also in terms of Chris Bush's course, so both scholarship and teaching, the avant-garde world, the literature of Dada and Surrealism. Here we have Breton, and his friends, Le Monde au temps du surréalisme, the world in the era of surrealism. And he says, as I learned from Delia's book, that the cartography of meridians and latitudes and longitudes traps the world in a cage spatially, and surrealists are going to explode that graph. So instead of the equator, you have this wavy line. You have now the Pacific Ocean as the center rather than the Atlantic. England has almost disappeared. Ireland is the big island off to the left, tiny little England looking like a keyhole. You have Paris, not much more of Europe at all. Russia and China are big. Sadly, no Japan, but you have the Philippines. and you have Indonesia and the Indian and the ocean, oceanic. Easter Island, looking almost like an animal there. L'Île de Pâques is there because Breton was collecting art from there. No United States. Other than Alaska, Labrador, and then Mexique, right, is there, a kind of a tiny South America. So this is a cartography that's very explicitly changing the world by a different cartographic description. So I wonder whether it's necessary to say, oh, the temporal thing is the thing that changes, and thinking about circulation or the mapping of the world is somehow conservative or just status quo, because I don't think that's what they thought or what I think we're doing.
Well, I mean, so you began with the temporality versus history, and it seems to me that history is a temporal category, so history is not opposed to the temporal.
Right.
The space versus time, there is a certain sense that, I mean, even when one talks about time, because when I talk about longitudes and latitudes, it is really a spatialized sense of time. So the question is, even if you do this kind of thing, it's still a kind of mapping. And the question is, what actually is the basis for this revaluation of changing any given cartography? Right? You could understand this in terms of people imagining a world that's different. So you remap the world differently, and of course that's what surrealism does. And then but then the question is like, what is the impetus for these kinds of remappings? Where is the principle of newness? Where does it come from? So then it seems to me that in that case, then one always has to return to the question of time.
But I think when can you return to the question of space? So newness also comes from, things are coming from Easter Island now, kinds of art we never saw before. Things are coming from Ireland. Ireland now looks more important as a place for revolutionary art than England does to Breton, polemically, right? As you could say also with Casanova, it's very pro-periphery. This is the engine of literary development, is regions within the contemporary world. So it just seemed to me, it's not an either-or, that the spatial is as revolutionary or as progressive as the temporal can be.
Well, I guess the question is, I mean, yes, if you think about circulation, and I'm certainly not discounting, because I think this is the major point of contention, that the way that what you're suggesting is that my sense of circulation is rather narrow, but I'm not admitting that circulation can have progressive or radical effects.
Well, you seem rather to be denying it, so that's...
No, but I mean, of course, that's not the case. If you think about, say, the circulation of the Bible, and the work of, say, someone like Paul Gilroy, when he looks at how the Bible has been used by African-American writers and so on, that can very obviously have very progressive effects. The main question is what, for me, and once again, that's why I began by saying for me it's primarily an ontological question, what is it that makes circulation happen? You can only circulate things between subjects, and you can only circulate stuff if there's already time, if time persists. So that's why for me, time
And you can
is
only circulate stuff if there's
original
a place to
category.
go from one to another. You need space as well.
Well, no, you need space, but in order for something to move, there must already be the persistence of time.
Yeah,
So for me,
absolutely.
that's
Yeah.
for me, that will be the primary category ontologically, and that's where the basis of rethinking these progressive effects of circulation will come from. The other thing is, I guess one thing I should have made clearer, that there seems to be, and partly that's because of my interest in the history of colonialism, the circulation of commodities is always tied in some way or other to capitalist exploitation. And that's the point you made, that, I mean, in all these works by Emily or by the Warwick Research Collective, that we seem to be equating circulation with capitalist exploitation. Now, of course, there are ways of understanding the circulation of commodities in a way that's progressive. If you think about my teacher Ben Anderson's book, he talks about print capitalism. Print capitalism produces something that is progressive, that is to say, for him, the nation as an imagined community. But for me, it seems that the link to capitalism is always going to be there with commodity circulation. So it's not a matter of just saying circulation as such is liberating.
Right.
It's always about analyzing
Absolutely.
in this or that particular case when circulation will lead to something that is progressive. The other distinction that you made is revolution versus reform, which corresponds to radicalism versus
Perhaps with liberalism, perhaps.
liberalism.
Yeah.
For me, and maybe this is my misreading, when you talk about this kind of semantic increase in meaning when something circulates, it immediately brought to mind, you know, that phrase in Capital where Marx says, money begets money. Just because money circulates, it begets money. It seemed to me a little bit like that something just by virtue of it moving can by itself almost alchemically increase itself, right?
So let me make a comment on that. This is, of course, partly these passages you're mentioning for 15 years ago, and I've tried to think of it since then. And in part, that circulation seemed to me a good starting point, partly because, as you say, you wouldn't be able to teach Amitav Ghosh or Pramodya unless the books were available in the market to assign to students, whether online or in
so
hard
markets
copy.
are important.
You know, and they can have these progressive effects. I think Gugu Atiango has a very nice book in the House of the Interpreter, a recent memoir, which he says, well, in the colonial Kenya, they were assigned Shakespeare and Delhi to make them good subjects. And he and his friends in high school learned, oh, you can overthrow a monarch? So there's a good example. And I have been thinking also, I mean, Vibke Denica is teaching the second half here. It makes a real point in her book, Classical World Literatures, that circulation models are not that interesting for the ancient world because a lot of stuff didn't circulate. And if you're going to think about ancient world literatures, you're comparing works from cultures that were quite distinct, and she does a very smart job with that. But I've also been thinking more about the world and the nation, and I agree totally that a good study of world literature should not assume the borders have evaporated or that the nation is no longer a meaningful entity. On the contrary,
and certainly not in Goethe himself. I mean,
No.
The nation is a very important
yes,
category.
absolutely. And I think this is true. So even if you think of the heyday of nationalism, but still today more than ever, and particularly we feel this very much in small countries. I was thinking about a couple of libraries in Ljubljana, how the world exists in the nation. And this was the first library open to the public, the seminary library, early 18th century. And it's a magnificent structure with Italian artists as the frescoes, and at the top, up there, the muse is holding open the Bible up to God. So books lead you to reverence for God. Then the National and University Library, done by a Slovene architect in the 30s. You come up this stairway, you progress from darkness to enlightenment. That's how he described it. And the you can see the glowing reading room that you come to. And in this library, books lead you to reverence for books and for the nation. And it's built as an expression of Slovene cultural identity just at the time when Slovenia is trying to get some independence from underneath the thumb of Serbia and Croatia after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, after a millennium of the Holy Roman Empire, and to this day, but what's interesting to me is that how important the world is to creating this national identity in the 30s, in the 20th century. And that you have the older kind of internationalism of the Latin tradition represented in the seminary library, and a kind of unity of knowledge. And my host who was showing me this library says, really a shame that once the university was established and the new library was built, they split up the collection of the seminary library. The theological works went to the theological faculty, the literature went to the National Library. It's separated now, and now it serves a nationalistic purpose in a kind of a narrow sense that it didn't. And my host was saying this is the kind of Slovene nation which is ab initio international. And you see this also in the national poet, Franz Prešeren, whose poem, A Toast, becomes the national anthem, God's blessing on all nations who long and work for that bright day when o'er earth's habitations no war, no strife shall hold its sway, who long to see all men free, no more shall foes but neighbors be. And this is the national anthem of Slovenia, is this internationalist hymn, which is also interesting because, he dies in 1849, but it's not then that it becomes the national anthem. It becomes the national anthem in 1989. It's decreed and protected by law just when Slovenia is finally becoming an actual independence, on its way to becoming an independent nation a couple of years later. So I think very much increasing myself is kind of figure ground reversal between the world and the nation. I used to more or less think of, here's the nation, there's a world outside. But if you think in terms of markets, not as a metaphor, but as actuality, the world exists only within a national market, in a national purpose, a national culture, progressive, regressive, whatever it may be. And my final real question, to pursue a bit more the revolution versus the reform, it seems to me in books like Emily's and the Warwick Group, and elements of yours, probably also, the focus is so strong on those works that are critiquing global capitalism that it's a very particular filter of the world's literature being produced even today, even in the global south. And I was thinking about Benedict Anderson's book and asking myself, so Pramodia Nantator, whom you have written about brilliantly, is mentioned, I think, a few points by Anderson, who was a great specialist on Indonesian, but he was also a great specialist on Thai literature and produced a whole volume of collections of Thai. But he does not talk about Kukrit Pramod. And I was thinking, well, here's an author that surprises me that he's not appearing, and not just in Benedict's work, but in anybody's work. So who are these people, and what would it be to add a Kukrit to a Pramodia? So they're both authors of remarkable sort of four-generation narratives about modernity, the coming of the nation, turn of the century up to the present. There's, of course, the Buru Quartet, on whom I think no one has written more brilliantly than Pheng Cheah in his Spectral Nationalities book. But this followed by a few years, a decade, 4 reigns by Kukrit, which is richly serialized. And it's the reigns of Rama the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Rama the 5th is the equivalent of the Meiji Emperor in the late 19th century, the reformist modernizer emperor, and then there's 3 successors up to the end of World War II and Japanese occupation, the end of Japanese occupation in the war. Told through a heroine who goes to court and lives across these generations. It's one volume, but it's a 4-cycle thing, a few years before the Buru. Now Kukrit is a really interesting guy. He starts out as an anti-colonial writer. His first book, written with his brother, tries to restore historicity and the voice to Rama V, who becomes the model for the Hollywoodized Anna, the King of Siam, or the King of Anai is a later version. Here it is. And they're so outraged by this Hollywood film, they write this book when they're quite young to say this is the real thing. Kukrit then he founds a newspaper perfect for Benedict Anderson called Siam Right, the Siam, the Thai nation. He founds a political party. He becomes an actor, literally an actor. He's also a specialist in classical dance. He does a stage adaptation of Rashomon, in which he acts as one of the starring roles. He then acts with Marlon Brando in a film called The Ugly American, in which he portrays the prime minister of a Southeast Asian country having to do with U.S. involvement in Indochina. 10 years later, he becomes prime minister of Thailand. You cannot make this stuff up. And I asked myself, so why is he never talked about? It touches everything that we should be interested in. And the only things I could think of, now Pramodi is a brilliant writer, but Kukrit is a really interesting writer and never discussed. And the only difference is I could really think why Benedict, who knew the stuff, doesn't, is two. One is that Kukrit is not a leftist, he's a royalist, and he's not a secularist, he's a Buddhist. His other best book that's available in English is called Many Lives, and envisions what happens after a ferry in the river that flows through Bangkok is overturned and all these people have died. And he tells a series of stories of how their own dharma led them to this point. It's a very beautiful, interesting, profoundly Buddhist thing. And there's a Buddhist subtext to the Four Rains. Now the thing about Kukrit is that he's a kind of progressive conservative, if one can say that. He's a modernist, he's a modernizer, very strong interest in women's culture, strong heroine, as you have also in Pramodi's Buddha Quartet, only even somewhat more so in Kukrit. And he should be in the mix of what we think is happening in Global South, and he's never discussed. And I think that in terms of the cartographies of circulation, I really think that those of us who are interested in, all of us who are interested in world literature are activists within our context. And that it's really very important to try to open out to a broader, more capacious range of whether it is the Global South, whether it is Southeast Asia, whether it is, the politics of narrative going on. And it struck me the imbalances we're dealing with can be represented here by a chart that I did a couple years ago. Just how often are people discussed in the MLA International Bibliography? And I divide it, so the hypercanon, I just pick it at random a few writers I'm interested in, but you have, if you look at the top here, Proust, Borges, Kafka, Woolf, and Joyce, they're writing English, French, German, and Spanish. You get the kind of upper major and lower majors, like upper middle class, lower middle class. You get minor authors, then I call ultra minor writers. We have Pramod there, Multatuli, the great Dutch writer, whom Pramodya is rewriting. Higuchi Ichio, whose museum is a block from here, most important Meiji-era woman writer. Pramodya there, 18. And what you see is these, they're writing in languages, by and large, not the big 4 or 5 languages, and these are extremely important writers. Now, this is just in this decade. Pramodya has been written about 45 times, according to the MLA bibliography, in sources that they check. Pramod, only that one article ever, 5 pages long, biographical survey, just nothing about him. And so it seems to me that we've only begun to do what we have to do as scholars and activists of world literature, is to open out the world to the range of writers who are being occluded for all kinds of reasons, including the filters that I think in general post-colonial studies have put on the archive that they're willing to look at.
No, I agree with you, but let's backtrack a little and talk about the world and nation thing. I don't think we disagree there.
I doubt it,
Because I think, with every kind of nation, you're really talking about in order to establish themselves as a nation culturally to gain respect. It's a kind of international recognition. You have to be recognized by other nations. So I think this was, for instance, the basis of Weimar classicism. And then, of course, what you get in the linguistic revolutions of 1858 is precisely this kind of thing. And then every socialist constitution has inbuilt some kind of internationalist rhetoric. And so, people forget socialism was not really in actualization a cosmopolitanism. It was largely an internationalism. So in that sense, then, that you are first a member of a nation, and then it's through the nation that you're a member of humanity. That is a kind of dictum that I think is very important, and certainly in someone like Goethe. You find that in even someone
And
like
that
Hegel.
Pression poem that I was showing is very much about that,
Yeah.
the nations together.
Yeah. The Marxist, the other thing is about why it is that the Thai writer does not figure. There is obviously some kind of bias in many of these writers, theorists, including in my own writing, that there is a bias towards some kind of more radical agenda. And I think, I mean, in a certain way, everyone has these kinds of biases, whether it's spoken or unspoken. And I mean, I would say, I mean, not in justification, but certainly, I mean, a more radical reworlding of the world is one that happens through the revolutionary tradition. But the question is, revolution is not always possible. I would say even now that revolution is no longer possible, in which case then there are other kinds of writing that would be important. Now, the royalism one, before he passed away, Ben was actually writing a book on monarchies. And he actually, I mean, had a great distaste for them, obviously, because of the kind of background he had. And so, I mean, my sense is for the sheer reason that this person is royalist in politics. He would not be interested in writing on this person. The other thing is translations and markets and commodities. You mentioned Negugi. Negugi, of course, I mean, as people know very well, at one point, when he started writing, he was James Negugi. Then he decided at one point he no longer wanted to bear the yoke of colonialism. So he changed, I mean, he removed the James. And then at one point he started writing only in Kikuyu. But of course, once he only wrote in Kikuyu, the books were censored, they were banned in Kenya, and they only survived in English translation. And that's when he moved from, I think, NYU to Irvine, he started the Center for Writing and Translation. That was when he became very interested in translation and those kinds of things that you mentioned, that when you read Macbeth, it's about killing, regicide, and so on. But at the same time, if you remember that, that example from Decolonizing the Mind, it talks about reading Wordsworth's poem, Daffodils. What would it mean for a child who had never seen a daffodil in his or her life to be identifying with this, this kind of flower, or to think about the seasons, winter, autumn, spring, whatever it is, when you live in Africa and there aren't these kinds of seasons. And for him it was a kind of brainwashing that had very bad effects. So on the one hand, translation and the circulation of texts can work obviously in a positive way, and I mean there's more, it's more than just Negugi. But on the other hand, they also can have these kinds of effects where, if you think about it, the colonial teaching of European literature as part of that the curriculum in colonial countries, that's probably one of the first institutionalized examples of world literature, right? So that's when it's used for a certain purpose. And I think Gary Viswanathan, your former colleague, has written brilliantly on that kind of thing. So I think that has to be borne in mind. On the other hand, unlike Emily and unlike Amir Mufti, I'm not against translation. And I'm not against markets. I think, I mean, for instance, that one author, the Indonesian author that I did want to write about, whose text had not been translated, Eka Kurniawan, wrote a book called Lelaki Harimau, which has been translated as Man Tiger after I published my book. And I did write on him in a very recent article in Diacritics. But the reason why he was translated was because Ben lobbied with Verso to have him translated. And Ben himself was an avid translator, translated Thai fiction, translated
in a mirror,
Indonesian fiction and so on. So, I mean, I think translation is very important. I think circulation is very important. It's just that one has to situate the effects, and there
Yeah,
are examples
absolutely.
where circulation can have very bad effects. I should also say, I mean, and this is Jingsu's field. When I was having a dinner in Macau many years ago with the Taiwanese writer Li Ang and also Howard Goldblatt, very well-known translator of Chinese fiction. Yeah, and we were talking, and we were saying actually Mo Yan would probably not have received the Nobel Prize if Howard Goldblatt had not translated him, if there was not such a proficient translator who had translated his work. And then I was talking to David Wang, your colleague, and he agreed. He said, like, Mo Yan should be grateful to Howard because this stuff is translated. And I mean, in the case of Negugi, obviously translation is very important because the Kikuyu writings, if they had not been translated, Devil on the Cross, would not have survived. So, I mean, in that sense, and in the Buru Quartet, there's a very interesting scene right at the end of the fourth novel, where the novels are a series of manuscripts, notebooks by this revolutionary. But the revolutionary is imprisoned, and we know he'll come to a bad end. The only way for the notebooks to survive that become the Buru Quartet is he has to give them to someone he trusts. But that someone he trusts has migrated to France. And so that's the new home, so to speak, of the spirit of the Indonesian nation. And it awaits to be repatriated.
And of course, the Buru Quartet gets banned in Indonesia,
Yeah.
and the translator, who is a diplomat, gets expelled from the country
Yeah,
back
yeah,
to Australia,
yeah,
so it's a
yeah,
complicated...
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
mean, no, of course, circulation, translation, these
Yeah.
are important. But in my case, I mean, the association of circulation with capitalism, the association of circulation, commodity circulation with capitalism, that has to be borne in mind. And second of all, those kinds of effects that people like Amir note, that in fact this kind of English Poco literature actually it shifts attention away from stuff that's written in other languages. And I think that's also very important. But then I think the larger question is like, just as a fully fledged notion of world literature needs to be regrounded in concepts of the world, and then we have to, take into account what these different world concepts are in these different languages, right? Because even in German, there's no difference between, in French, there's no difference between world and globe, right? I mean, mondialisation is used both for world, monde is used both for world, but also their version of globalization. So it's important to reground some idea of world literature on these different world concepts from different languages. And then it's also important to take into account all these, the link, because in order to know what these world concepts are, there has to be some kind of relation with area studies. It's not just a casual flirtation. So I think, I mean, in that sense, the importance of translation, but at the same time also to be greedy and to have it both ways, and to be able to link up with this in-depth knowledge of these other world areas and these other languages.
So I think, hope you've been finding this interesting. I think this could be a good time to open up the floor for questions, comments, objections. Let's see where you'd like to take it from here.
Yeah.
Hiya. Thanks for your presentations. They were wonderful. I just wanted to ask, since you talked about Heidegger and temporality a lot, when Heidegger speaks of temporality in What is Metaphysics, he speaks about the concept of boredom and things having their own time. And if you meet them out of time, that is the cause of boredom. That is potentiality that is lost. I wondered if, in the context of literature, this means that as well as literatures that may be appropriate for us to recuperate or recover right now, there are also literatures that we should let die, literatures that we are out of time with, literatures that need to be addressed in their finitude and say, well, we no longer have time for you, or your time will come again.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Of course, I mean, the larger question is whether you can disentangle Heidegger's account of the world and his account of time with from his anti-Semitism. Because very obviously, I mean, as I mentioned in the brief presentation, he really seriously thought that the only two languages you could think philosophically in are German and Greek because of the status of the copula in these languages. And then, of course, someone in the seminar earlier asked me about the Black Notebooks. And the interesting thing is, of course, the concept of the world stretches throughout his corpus. And in the middle of his corpus, there is that famous stuff where he says that Agamben stole from, where he says the human being is with world, Midwelt, and the animal is poor of world, and the stone is weltlos. But of course, the implicit assumption is as long as you are human Dasein, you are always with world. But then, of course, in the Black Notebooks, what he says is the Jews are worldless. So obviously, this is very, very disturbing. And yes, I think he would say that there are some, and I mean, of course, what he privileged was not literature per se, but dictum, right, poetry. And very specifically, two main poets, Hölderlin and Rilke. So, I mean, obviously, there is you can't take him on wholesale, because he would say that there are some literatures that don't count, that do not express what he would call authentic temporality, and that they should be discounted. Yes?
Your account of world literature was framed as a defense against a certain relegation of literature by, at the hands of a Marxist view of culture. My question is, so on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, in your analysis, you still lend capital a primary analytic importance.
Yeah.
So why?
Okay, so I should say that part of, because we were discussing today David's book together with Casanova and Franco Moretti's book. And I think what's different about David's book is that he actually values reading literature. And he says part of what's important about that it should be world literature is that it should be literature. And you don't get that in Franco Moretti, as I was telling people. I mean, for Franco, there's no difference between a Penny Dreadful and a work that can be considered literature in that highbrow sense. And I mean, for Franco, it's very clearly circulation for the sake of circulation. It's what sells the most, what's the most highly valued commodity. That's important. And that, for me, with Franco and with Casanova, if you look at the Casanova book, it's not a small book, but there are no close readings. One doubts whether she has even, I mean, one suspects that she has not read all those book titles that she mentions in the book. So in that sense, then, it was against that kind of reductionism that I insisted on the specificity of literature and the link between literature and world. On the other hand, there is a certain sleight of hand, because the first half of the book is really on philosophies of the world and this idea of worlding and what the link between worlding and literature is. But then when I talk about the cases are cases of these texts that are anti-capitalist globalization. And that's my own political bias. And because I am interested in questions of globalization, I mean, remember I mentioned at the start that my interest in all of this came out of an early interest in cosmopolitanism that was closer to the social sciences and so on, right? So that's that aspect of it. But the question is whether or not this account of world literature as worlding literature, whether it works for texts that are not about post-colonial globalization, that are not post-colonial literature. And my response to this is, you tell me. if you think that the theory is applicable, because for me primarily this is a work of literary theory. I don't teach in a literature department. So I don't do literary history, I don't do literary historiography. The question is, if this account of literature, world literature, seems to you to be interesting, is it plausible if you are not just studying post-colonial literature? But then the question is, you tell me. I mean, it might not be interesting, and that's fine.
My view would be that it is more interesting when it has to be adapted to a wider archive that will play off it differently. And indeed can provide a way of reading more fully works, like even say the Promodia, the Baroque Quartet, you know, the kind of literary historical thing is interesting. So
Yeah.
the quartet ends, the fourth volume is narrated by this kind of police official who's like been destroying the hero, but yet he kind of been troubled by it. It's really interesting. This is a kind of a brilliant reworking of Multatuli, this Max Havelaar, or the coffee auctions of the Dutch trading company, of which the narrator is this idiot named Droogstapel, dry as dust or dry stubble, who gets the papers of this colonial official who's trying to work against the excesses, brutalization of the Dutch in East India. But so he had this brilliant comic idiot narrator describing these horrific events he doesn't really understand. And Promodia is redoing this. It's absolutely amazing. I don't think you ever mentioned Multatuli.
No,
in
that's
the book.
right. Yeah.
So it's a different kind of
Yeah,
approach.
yeah.
But that also could mean that the effect that Multatuli is having, which is a reformist effect and not a revolutionary effect,
Yeah.
but he actually has an effect.
Yeah.
Within a couple of years after this volume is published in about 1860, the Dutch start to abolish the culture system, a very resonant term, that has requirements that the colonial natives grow the crops that they want them, like pepper, to sell. So it had a cultural effect, literally, in agriculture.
Yeah.
You know, this reformist book, because Multatuli he's not exactly he's like Kipling. He was arguing against the excesses
he's
of
a
a
reformer.
crop
He's a
system. He's a reformer.
reformist.
And it had a real life effect that so far Promodia has not had.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's absolutely important, and I mean, but in order to understand this fully, one would then need to, I mean, have some kind of link to area studies, look at colonial history, to be able to understand what FSI means, what the culture system means, and so on, right? Which, if you're just picking this up from, say, in a literature department where you're probably just reading Pram next to Salman Rushdie or whoever, then that's the stuff that you're not going to get. Now, the other thing is, I did at one point after I finished writing on the Baroque Quartet, he has a wonderful epic, which is a maritime epic, which is set in the pre-colonial period called Aruz Balik. But unfortunately, it has not been translated, and he tries to imagine what the world would be if there had not been Dutch colonialism. What the maritime period in Indies history, the Dutch is before the Dutch, so to speak. But as I said, it's very hard to write on something that hasn't been translated, because no one has read the text, and then you have to do a lot of plot reconstruction and so on. And I think we shouldn't need to do that. So unfortunately, Max Lane has been trying to translate it for quite some time. But has not, I think, finished. So, hopefully it'll be translated.
Next question.
Hi there. So pardon my ignorance. I am just a recently finished my undergrad, so apologies if anything comes across as ignorant. I'm just was kind of curious when you were talking about kind of the temporality of kind of looking at more so works in the last kind of 50 years versus Damrosch looking for more longer term. You mentioned kind of that a lot of it was kind of the Eurocentric of the kind of more historical time. Isn't that kind of short-sighted with looking at texts like the Shahnameh or even Journey to the West? Just wondering kind of what you would think about that on texts that do kind of look cross-cultural, intercultural kind of relations in other texts that aren't kind of the typical older Western canon?
So, I mean, I would say the journey to the West, I mean, people probably know this as if you are not a Chinese literature person, you probably know this as the story of the Monkey King. Because they've made, I mean, lots of movies, both in Hong Kong and also TV series and cartoon series.
And Whaley's Abridgment.
Yeah. So, you know, so this is how it's circulated in popular culture. But I think that in itself, the journey to the West is, in terms of Chinese literary history, it's a fairly recent text. Because of course, I remember when I first arrived at Berkeley, one of my colleagues in East Asian Studies asked me, which people say you work on China, which dynasty do you work on? You know, so and I write a fair bit about Chinese film, but of course it doesn't belong to a dynasty unless it belongs to the late Qing period. So I mean, in terms of, I would say like the Journey to the West is a modern text in Chinese literary history. So that doesn't really solve the issue about why it is that I am primarily focusing on texts that are fairly recent, because the Journey to the West is also a recent text. But if, let's say you treat it as an older classical text, you know, then you would look at, say, the references to Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, and so on, right? The odd relationship between Taoism and Buddhism in these kinds of texts, because I mean, what happens there is pretty syncretic. You would also look at then, I mean, but you see for me, but that's really an appropriation of the past for the present. And then you look at these adaptations, and you would then study, I mean, you're looking at it in terms of a sociology of literature or whatever it is. Why is it that there are so many of these filmic retellings of this kind of thing? Why was it made into comics? Why was it this text as opposed to some other text, right? And then, of course, you could do if you were doing some kind of folk tale narrative, some kind of Propian analysis, then you would say, oh, you can link it to some kind of quest narrative, right? So those would be other ways of including this in a more in a more expansive kind of study. But then that's very different from if you were doing it as a China specialist, and you are looking at all these intertexts, and you have the languages, so or the language, or you know, then you're going back to look at, say, Buddhist scriptures and stuff like that, to see how that stuff is being appropriated.
Is this coming? Here. No, here's a microphone.
Okay, thanks. So my question actually jumps right off of the previous one, because when you mentioned the regional specialist versus someone who's
area specialist
specialist versus someone who is approaching texts with the world literature perspective, you mentioned regarding the area specialist, you said they are immersing themselves in the text, or they are pretending to immerse themselves. And so I was wondering where that word pretending comes from. Was that an offhand thing? Was it is pretending, are you?
It's an offhand. It's an offhand thing. It's an offhand thing, but it's also from personal experience. For many years, people did not know that I knew Chinese, and so people never asked me to write about Chinese material. Then at some point, I don't know how they discovered that I knew, because I mean, I'd never published anything on Chinese literature before. At some point, I don't know how they found out I knew Chinese. Then, because I write a lot on cosmopolitanism, and they want something on China and cosmopolitanism or whatever, then they kept starting to ask me to write stuff for them. David Wang, when he edited this new literary history of China for Harvard, asked me to write something, for example, and that's just only one example. And I said it would be, after all, I mean, I've read these texts because I know the language, but I'm not a specialist in Chinese literary history. I mean, even if you do modern Chinese literature, it's very, very hard if you you're not well versed in classical Chinese. There's so many allusions, and the literary language is very, very different from ordinary language. So I said it would be a hoax for me to pretend that I could write on Chinese literature, even modern Chinese literature, because although I've read this stuff for fun, I don't have the training. But I could very easily have passed, so to speak, because unless you are a specialist, no one can tell the difference quite a lot of the time. And what I then did was to say, you know, I am working on Chinese film because I'm writing a book on Chinese world cinema and globalization, and I will give you a chapter that's on Chinese film. You know, but so that's, I mean, an off-the-cuff remark, because if you're in area studies, it's very easy to pass, especially if you are a native speaker.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
So I guess my mind kind of went towards what is the work of someone who is looking at texts with world in mind, and someone who is looking at it with area in mind, and what is this thing that splits them?
Okay, so I'm going to bring David back into this conversation, because I think this partly stems from the debate that you had with Gayatri, that stuff about, I mean, her dismissal of world literature, which partly the Emily Actor stuff cribs from.
Right.
So why, I mean, is there a real disagreement? Because I once said to David half in jest that he probably actually knows more languages than Gayatri.
I've forgotten more languages than Gayatri, that's it. You know, I may think she and I actually had more agreement than what we might have expected on that. I think, you know, you need both. But, and I would come back to what you're saying. I somewhat disagree that if I'm saying that where literature gains in translation, it's the market, you know, money making money. Because I was saying there are losses and there are gains. That it's really that the work becomes something different. It manifests differently. It's phenomenologically different in a different place. Those are the works that work. And this goes to your question about the area specialist, because you know, there's a kind of understanding of the text for which you need to know every text that author had read. And then you have that world. And that's one kind of instantiation of a text. So then that can be, you know, Bengali and you know everything Tagore read, or it can be you're a medievalist who knows Italian and you know every figure that Dante is referring to. On the other hand, you can look at Dante in relation to Homer and Virgil, and you don't necessarily need to know all those things. I struggle with this a lot because I'm often working on stuff that, you know, the specialists know differently. So like I've worked, say, on Mechthild von Magdeburg in my book, and how her work does not translate across genders very well, and the guys who take her up completely change what she and lose a lot of the value. So she has not gained in their translation, neither into Latin or just into other vernaculars if they're not attending to it. But in order to work on Mechthild, I don't need to know everything about medieval Christology. I'm sorry, it puts me to sleep. I'm never going to know everything about it. And no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm looking at the gender issues that are going on, you know, and so there are different whole ways to contextualize, I think. And I was giving some lectures here last year, and I was talking about Higuchi Chiu and Lu Xun and James Joyce, as writers who all, and Akutagawa, as writers who all got their start thanks to modernist magazines as short story writers. None of them intended to be a short story writer. Higuchi Chiu was a poet, and James Joyce wanted to write plays and poems, you know, but there was a market because there were these magazines, and young writers from the periphery of the system could get a foot in. And I thought this is really something that's happening at the same time. If they don't know each other, there's a lot of circulation of how these printing presses are moving and who's reading what at one remove. And a Japan specialist responded and said, oh, but I want to know the context in which Higuchi is writing. And I said, well, there's different contexts. One context is, who are all the Japanese writers she knew, and the other context is what's happening to printing presses and how modernism is working. So I think one is an area specialist, so all of us working in world literature should know how, for our purposes of our topic, what do we need to know of the specialist work, and what do we not need to know, and what can we bring for a different instantiation of the work as it appears in different ways.
So would you say it would be fair to say that, the area specialist approach would actually do much less to make the text of the writer in question popular? Because, if you taking your approach would probably write something that would be more readable by a larger audience than someone who's an area specialist who writes that.
Well, my polemic is I feel often in some of the fields I work in, like Icelandic studies or ancient Greece, the specialists spend so much time making you feel you can't even think about the text unless you spend your entire life on it, and then they wonder why they have so few readers. So, Now the other extreme is if you just sort of waltz in and don't pay attention. I don't think that's good. I think you really need to engage seriously with the area specialist. So in the ideal world, if I'm writing about Mechthild, I should say something at the Mechthild specialist. I hadn't thought about what her translation matters, and I've had people tell me that. At the same time, I'm not going to contribute to the Christology.
But would you say, that in a sense, half in jest, that there is some resentment in the charge that the world literature person or the world literature approach is a glibber, easier approach, because they would like to have the kinds of readers that your approach produces?
I understood the word. I asked my older brother, Leo, who very prolific 18th century scholar. He published something, a sixth book by the age of 45, and asked, well, how did he do it? And he says, glibness is the curse of the Damrosches. So maybe I have to acknowledge that. I think if it's done badly, it becomes glib. If area specialist becomes badly, it becomes hermetic. And I think they need to infuse each other. Do we have time for another question? Yes, please.
Hi, so thank you for the really amazing talk. Just going back towards the end, you did mention a little bit about translation, so the daffodil example and all of that. So my question is just that, so I guess to what extent does a translator become too powerful, or when the translator is given way too much power?
If only.
I think translation is a very, very frightening thing, because you think that, in many cases, you are really the only, for people who don't know the original language, you're the only access to that text. And once again, let me tell you an anecdote. When I was writing my dissertation, Spectral Nationality, the book that came out of my dissertation, partly has 2 chapters are on the Buru Quartet, as David mentioned. Jonathan Culler and another member of my committee, of course, could not read Indonesian. The translation of the Buru Quartet is problematic. So when Ben said, if I want to write on this, I have to translate it myself. I did try to translate it myself, but of course, I went on the job market, I got a job, I hadn't finished my dissertation, and in order to file, you have to send this whole text to your whole committee to read. And I had only done the translations of the excerpts for the first 2 novels. But I had to file very quickly. And that was when I started to panic, because I realized if I were to do the excerpts that I was using, if I had to do the translations for the other 2 novels myself, it would take forever and I wouldn't be able to file. And that was when Ben stepped in and he translated the excerpts from the last 2 novels for me. And it was a great relief for me, because I didn't have to feel that I was doing something that was horrible to this text that I respected. Right? So, yes, I think it's a very onerous responsibility.
My footnote to that would be, I think, translation used to be something that was just maybe you shouldn't really do, or do just at night, on the side. I think increasingly we find much more activism. There's much more attention and respect for translation than there was even 20 years ago. There are prizes that young people are getting and becomes part of a tenure file in a way I think it would not have been before. And I think we need to be much more activist about translating and really getting these works circulated. And we, if not we, who better to actually care about these texts and bring them to the world well. So.
Yeah, and novelists or writers care. I mean, they have their own translators that they feel very comfortable working with. They would feel very sad if, say, Howard Goldblatt refused to translate someone because he had too much work on his plate. I mean, you know, so it is a very onerous responsibility, and it's very important.
Maybe one last question. Yeah, up at the top, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I just have a general question, like how do you see the relations between third world literature and world literature? Because like, I mean, there are a lot of influence and also interactions between like the Sufi texts, how they traveled in Africa, and then how like many Swahili novels were translated into Chinese, and Chinese works were translated into Swahili. And but I mean, in Jameson's sense, like third world literature is emphasizing on nationalism, but then like how do you generally see the relations between the two? Thank you.
I think it's very important because part of this third worldism is tied to a certain kind of socialist politics, and there is this kind of socialist internationalism. You know, there is a scholar of Chinese literature at Penn State. His name escapes me because it's late in the day and I've been going for most of today. Do you know that, who wrote a book called Socialist Cosmopolitanism? Nikolai Volon, right? So he has a book called Socialist Cosmopolitanism, which is very interesting because it looks at the translation of writing from different places into China in the period of, say, the Cultural Revolution and so on, because people, the misinterpretation or the misconception of China during that period was that it was closed and insular, but actually it wasn't. And so, I mean, there's all this stuff that's actually very interesting. And then you have to remember that part of this, I mean, also part of the Cold War structure was that there was a lot of exchange between the PRC and, you know, African countries and so on. So I think that's part of that kind of different sphere of circulation, so to speak.
So I think we're at 7 o'clock now. Thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.